All right, I think we can start while we wait for other speakers to join us. It's a busy day, hectic day of negotiation on the latest draft text here in Dubai, and we know that we're all very busy, so I would like to thank you very much for joining this side event this afternoon with us. My name is Jacopo Bencini, and I work as policy advisor on EU and multilateral climate policies for the Italian Climate Network. And today's event title is Money Plus Rules. When we thought about developing together a side event with our partners from Northwestern University, and then I will introduce the other speakers and give them the floor. Of course, we were still in the midst during summer of the works of the Transitional Committee on the Loss and Damage Fund, and there was no certainty at the time, of course, that the whole package would have been approved so smoothly and quickly on the first day of the COP. When we got assigned this very date of the 10th of December, we thought, well, maybe they will be still negotiating, Istiakh, and maybe we will have our side event in the hottest moment of the COP on this very topic. This is clearly not the case, even though negotiations are ongoing on the Santiago network and on other details of related to loss and damage, but regarding the fund, we are still sure in any case that the title was correct and then the idea was correct towards the next years and the implementation, the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. Money plus rules. We have seen that in recent days, especially during the Leaders Summit, during the first days, some pledges in terms of climate finance arrived under the new L&D Fund. We saw that there has been a debate, especially emerging from civil society, on how the rules from the Transitional Committee, please join us, hi Sam, how the rules outlined by the Transitional Committee could be satisfactory or not for many, and we would like to discuss this further today with our guest, which I really thank for being with us. I would like to start from introducing Istiakh Ahmed from Northwestern University, our partner from the US, who organized this event together with us. And by the way, I know it's a spoiler, but they published recently a very interesting article on loss and damage finance on Nature, and that article was co-authored by Saleemul, who was supposed to be in the panel with us today. Unfortunately, as you know, he passed away recently, so we would like, at the end of this side event, to give a big round of applause for him as well, as we were thinking of having him in the fight together with us and in the future. Then we have Professor Lisa Van Halla from the University College of London. Thank you very much for joining us. Then on her left, Dr. Elisa Cagliari from the Euro-Mediterranean Center of Climate Change, Centro Euro-Mediterraneo per i Cambiamenti Climatici, and as well here as Viracao and Jangada, an organization which works between Brazil and Italy on climate communication and climate awareness, and Samuel Okorie from the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, who just joined us. And other speakers will join us shortly, for sure. We need to introduce the topic properly before getting to politics, I would say, and getting to understand why do we need this kind of strong commitment towards both money and rules under the Loss and Damage Fund. And I would like to start with Professor Van Halla for an introduction to the topic before moving on. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And I think I have slides that will be coming up in a second. Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for being here today. I assume if you're here, you know a little something about loss and damage, so I'm going to skim through my normal introduction a little bit more quickly. And I suppose I want to pick up on what Jacopo said and said maybe we are still in the heat of this thing in two different ways. You know, even if things were agreed on the first day on loss and damage at this COP, which really is unprecedented and took me by surprise, we're in the heat still in two different ways. One, of course, this has been a record-breaking year in terms of heat. We've had the hottest summer on record, so we're still sitting in that place. And I would argue also when it comes to loss and damage, we're really in the middle of things getting warmer, because now we need to think about implementation. What does it look like to think about what loss and damage means and how we respond to that at the national level, in regional organizations, and globally as well, and thinking about how that sits in the global stocktake. So I don't need to rehearse all the reasons why loss and damage matters, right? We're seeing wildfires in Canada, the US, Europe, hottest summer on record, multi-year droughts in East Africa, unprecedented flooding in China. And we know that these extreme weather events, like floods and hurricanes and fires, and slow onset hazards, like sea level rise, rising temperatures, and the increasing salinity of soil, is resulting in losses and damages. We're witnessing these limits to adaptation, which mean that these impacts are resulting in what in the loss and damage world we talk about as economic losses. So declining agricultural productivity, loss of infrastructure, declining business productivity, and what has been commonly referred to as non-economic losses, though I've always felt that term doesn't quite capture what's really those things that are most meaningful to people. And I remember hearing Saleem saying maybe we should talk about this as human and ecosystem losses instead of non-economic losses, which I'm pretty sure is a term that an economist came up with. So we have this understanding, and in the science on loss and damage, there's a real love of these bifurcations of concepts: slow onset, extreme weather, economic, non-economic, hard and soft limits to adaptation. But what we're really talking about here is this understanding of the adverse effects of climate change that are not or cannot be avoided by mitigation or adaptation. And we talk here about hard adaptation limits, those kind of limits to our physiological responses to climate change. How tall can you build a seawall to keep the sea back? But we're also interested in those kind of more socially constructed adaptation limits, the soft ones, those ones that pose barriers culturally, sociologically, economically, or politically to adapting effectively. This year's adaptation gap report produced by the UN Environment Program includes a chapter on loss and damage for the first time. And it shows that adaptation efforts are slowing on all fronts. So that means planning, adaptation planning, implementation of adaptation actions, and slowing on the provision of financed adaptation. Whereas we know what we really need is a ramping up of efforts. We also know there's a strong relationship between mitigation and adaptation efforts on one hand and losses and damages on the other. And so in this diagram, you can see that language on averting, minimizing, and addressing, and starting to really tease out what is it we mean when we talk about addressing loss and damage from that comprehensive risk management side of things, but also after the event. And as we've kind of seen these things happening more and more in the world, we've also seen an increase in attention to the issue within the negotiations. So if you look at the kind of history of the negotiations, what we've done here, and this is a graphic by Carbon Brief based on some research that our team had done earlier, what we're looking at here is kind of mentions of particular terms that we might associate with loss and damage over time. And so you can see there in red, mentions of loss and damage, in blue, mentions of insurance, and in the kind of lighter beige color, mentions of liability or compensation. And so what we saw is a real increase in that kind of mentions of loss and damage leading up to the adoption of the Warsaw International Mechanism 10 years ago in 2013. And then over the last few years, we've seen this exponential increase in mentions of loss and damage specifically. And of course, what we've had is kind of a rendering taboo of any language on compensation, right? Particularly since the Paris Agreement and the fine print language that accompanied that decision in terms of Article 8 not being a basis for liability or compensation. And a kind of continuing discussion around insurance, but again at a lower level than this more general term, which I've argued in earlier work was a constructively ambiguous concept in terms of having loss and damage embedded within international climate law, but that has since proved somewhat problematic in terms of starting to kind of work on the concrete issues that we're dealing with here. So just to give a little bit more detail on kind of where we've come from and where we've been to, and I talk about this path of loss and damage, but for those who've been following it for a long time, it feels like more of a roller coaster, particularly in recent years in terms of highs and lows and unprecedented and historic wins, for example, in Sharm el-Sheikh. But what we have seen is an increasing institutionalization, so the adoption of the Warsaw International Mechanism in 2013, the establishment of its executive committee in that time, the establishment of a number of expert groups over the last 7 years, and this is where we really see the kind of motley crew of issues that falls in that loss and damage banner. So everything from the task force on displacement to the expert group on non-economic losses, slow onset events, one on action and support, which took years to set up in the end. And the idea there is really underpinned by one where the executive committee is going to catalyze other organizations to be thinking about these topics that are related to loss and damage, that others, and based on research that Elisa and I have done in a book that'll be coming out sometime next year, really trying to understand how people situated in different ministries or different policy sectors are understanding what loss and damage means for them, if they're sitting in the disaster risk reduction space as opposed to those sitting in sustainable development, those working in fisheries departments, for example. What does loss and damage mean for them, and how are they going to start to think about this? In 2019, of course, there was the agreement on the Santiago Network on loss and damage. Its mandate includes facilitating access to knowledge, resources, and technical assistance needed to address climate risks comprehensively. And then last year, of course, we saw that historic decision in Sharm el-Sheikh to establish a loss and damage fund and funding arrangements. And it's that latter part that's often forgotten, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And this year, of course, we've seen the work of the Transitional Committee over the course of 5 meetings to agree on the terms and modalities of that new fund and those arrangements. And that led us to this announcement on day 1 of the operationalization of the new fund. So where does that leave us today? And this is my last slide, and I'll wrap up. But I wanted to say a few things on these 4 different topics. So we saw this adoption of the Global Loss and Damage Fund on day 1 of COP28. Current pledges are at about 700 million US. The UAE committed 100 million, and that really changed the donor landscape for the first time, in my understanding, in terms of cutting across that CBDR principle. But there are a number of remaining issues, and there are 3 questions I would put, I suppose, to those who are more involved in the negotiation, my colleague Elisa here, and some of the others who might be able to join us later. First, there are questions about this new body that remain. So we have, obviously, it was established to be hosted by the World Bank. There are questions about the appointment of the board. We know the composition of that, but individuals can make a difference. How is it going to provide funding? There's questions in terms of whether the project-style approach is appropriate for loss and damage, and Istiakh will be talking about that in a moment, I believe. Second issue is, where does this fund sit within the wider landscape of climate finance within that UNFCCC sphere, right? There are questions of trade-offs. The Adaptation Fund this year has so far received pledges of about $160 million US, and that's half of what it received at COP26. We're obviously not finished with COP yet, but we've seen this huge increase in loss and damage funding, and the question I have is, are we witnessing a loss and damage pivot from donors, which might be problematic given the consistent calls for new and additional finance for loss and damage rather than a shifting of money around within existing pots. A third question concerns this issue of those other funding arrangements rather than just the fund itself. And the mosaic approach, which was talked about a lot in Sharm el-Sheikh, was really pushed for by developed countries. Yet my sense is we don't really have a true understanding of what that is and what that looks like, and how that relates to some of this funding that's been pledged. So what does it mean for development organizations, for humanitarian organizations like the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and for those working on disaster risk? Last week, it was also agreed that the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and UN Office for Project Services will together host the Santiago Network for loss and damage. This took a little bit longer than we were expecting, but there are a lot of questions there about what that's going to look like, how that's going to work. Third issue, I think, still remains open, though again, the negotiators will be able to speak to this, possibly, is the role of loss and damage in the global stocktake. And there's been an emerging literature on this, with scholars working on what this should look like and how it should work. How are we going to effectively take account of loss and damage when thinking about whether we're meeting the objectives of the Paris Agreement? That also includes the breadth of issues grouped under this idea of loss and damage. So is there going to be language on forced migration, displacement, climate refugees, if you will? And the final question is the one that has kind of, more technical possibly or legal, but the question of governance of the Warsaw International Mechanism. And this is one that continues to be kicked down the road. Whether the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage is going to sit under the Convention or under the Paris Agreement. This has been a thorny, protracted issue over recent years. It's possible it's become less thorny given the establishment of the fund, but this is something I think to watch out for as well. I want to thank you very much for being here and for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Van Halen, for this first introduction to the topic and how the topic is actually tackled in these negotiations. And yes, there's a debate ongoing on the GST draft at the moment on how loss and damage will be treated in the final test of this COP, and we'll get back to that later. And I would like to give the floor now to the co-organizers together with us of this event, and we have heard about needs, we have heard about this history of this topic under UNFCCC negotiations, but I would like to ask Istiakh Ahmed how to get the money to where it's needed fast, which is also the title of your article on Nature.
Thank you, Jacopo, and thank you, Professor Van Halen, for kind of setting the base for me and sharing the history of loss and damage negotiation. So hello everyone, I'm Istiakh Ahmed. I'm a PhD student at Northwestern University at the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. And I will be presenting on, the title of our paper says, Climate Loss and Damage Funding, How to Get Money to Where It's Needed Fast. Basically, the paper will focus a lot, the process of money getting to the community level and where it needs. I'll be presenting on behalf of my colleagues, Laura Kul, Faisal Rahman, Jamie Shin, Johanna Rango, and Dr. Saleemul. As we all know that the establishment of the fund has been accepted, and there is no doubt that this is an historical achievement. The new loss and damage fund represents an opportunity to kind of create something which is more responsive, at the same time it kind of a lot more just, which can be a little different than different funding that we already have. But lessons from the past will need it to be taken. Learning from the experience of other climate funds such as Green Climate Fund can be very helpful for loss and damage fund so as not to reinvent the wheel again but improve upon GCF's limitations. Here we outline our 4 recommendations for an operation of the loss and damage fund, which are grounded in principles of climate justice and are based on lessons from the GCF decision making and approval process. We have done, oh sorry. So we have analyzed 15 board meetings, which comprises 181 proposals. So we have done a video ethnography of all the board meetings, and we have analyzed all the conversations through different themes. Oh, no. It's here, right? Okay, no, so my slides are a little different.
Right? Yes, okay.
It's here. So we have done a thematic coding of all the concerns raised by developed countries and developing countries. We also have analyzed those concerns under different thematic area and who raised the concerns and divided them into different groups. We also have done a survey with all the accredited entities and NDAs. However, we have shared the survey with everyone, but we received 42 responses from them. And we also have done an analysis of all the publicly available data on GCF portfolio. Yeah, sorry. So why look at Green Climate Fund? The Green Climate Fund was established in 2010 through a very similar process and is currently the world's largest dedicated climate fund supporting mitigation and adaptation in low and middle income countries. It has approved $13.5 billion USD to 243 projects as of November 1st, 2023. The goal of GCF is to analyze, innovative, and mobilize climate finance to support transformative climate action. It has a board with equal representation from developed and developing countries. So, some of the key features that it makes the fund unique, that it's country-driven, it has kind of several financial instruments. At the same time, it has a mandate to take risk and provide more patience capital to its recipient. However, the GCF has been criticized for being difficult to access, lacking appetite for taking risks to respond to urgency of the climate crisis. This presentation is not to criticize the GCF Climate Fund, but understand what factors create challenging environment for a fund that can be avoided for the new established loss and damage fund. Additionally, the study was only possible because of GCF's effort to make all the board meetings recordings and portfolio data publicly available. These issues may be present in other fundings as well, but it's difficult to understand since we do not have the access to those data. So the first recommendation that we have is, as mentioned earlier, GCF received most criticism because of its access issue, where there have been improvements in time it takes that GCF to approve projects. It still takes more than 2 years on average for a proposal to be accepted. On 1/5, which is mostly 39 projects, took more than 3 years, which is 3 to 5 years. As you can see on the graph here, on average, all the mitigation projects took 515 days to be approved. Adaptation projects took 743, and cross-cutting projects took 718 days since submitting the concept note to be approved by the board. Additionally, the GCF was envisioned to be more accessible than other climate funds. However, more than 3/4 of funded projects went to international organizations such as UNDP and World Bank. So you can see on the graph, 76% went to international entities, whereas only 13% went to national entities, and 11% went to regional entities. So as we understand, speed and agility would be key to the loss and damage fund success. So the committee should focus on few areas. First, and which we already have seen some progress, the TC already has developed the draft and has been accepted within 1 year, which in GCF's case took 5 years, so there is already a progress, but getting the fund up and running quickly should be one of the priorities. To get going, an initial phase should be developed for disbursing small grants of $50,000 to $100,000 by the end of 2024. Simple rules for accessing those funds should be developed in the consultation with countries, civil societies, organizations, and other stakeholders. In our view, loss and damage fund should adopt a learning by doing approach with initial allocation treated as experiments, demonstrations, or pilots, since we do not really have much experience on this. The fund should work with researchers and community-based organizations to document those experiences, such as how the money was spent and how effective the measures were. The goal should be to deepen knowledge about how to address loss and damage effectively. Further complexities such as larger awards and alternative forms of financing can be added later on, so that we have the fund up and go and we can have some experiences with the small grants. Few models that can be drawn as an example for loss and damage to look at, loss and damage fund to look at. One example is Global Environment Facilities Small Grant Program, which has given $725 million to more than 26,000 projects since it began in 1992. Lessons can also be drawn from the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, who has a mandate to approve less than, which is minimum, which is below $100,000. The director can approve projects below $100,000 without going to the board. So GCF also, the Loss and Damage Fund also can have a mechanism where it can have a focal point to develop, to approve such small grants, and to avoid bias, this position can be a rotational position based on 2 years. Second recommendation is a wider range, it should be, yeah.
All right, sorry.
The second area the fund can focus on is a wider range of organizations beyond governments, including non-government organizations, grassroots organizations, and local communities need to be accessed loss and damage fund. Climate outcomes are stronger when communities are involved in decision-making and responsible for their own adaptation. For example, in one mangrove forest restoration scheme in Vietnam, the community engagement led to a mangrove survival rate of 70 to 90% over 3 years, which is way higher than earlier approaches. To start with, for example, national governments could nominate eligible organization to access support from the fund, so that the whole accreditation process can be avoided from loss and damage fund. Connecting to this point of access, loss and damage fund also can request, loss and damage fund should Sorry, I just need some water.
You have it?
I have it.
Do you want this one?
Hmm? Connecting to this point of success, loss and damage funding request must be simple to make and quick to access. As loss and damage fund grows, it should ensure the proposals do not require overly sophisticated data or complex justifications. Another aspect where access to GCF funds are complicated. GCF proposals need to use local climate projections to demonstrate the climate rationale of the project, as well as calculations of economic viability, a clear theory of change, risk analysis and evidence, and indicators of contributions to sustainability. Additionally, the GCF can take months to provide feedback on the proposals, and it might ask for new studies or data to be collected, resulting in delays and even in proposals being abandoned. By contrast, as the Loss and Damage Fund would need to respond quickly, it can draw learning from Bangladesh government. The country, as part of its standing orders on disaster, uses a one-page SOS form in the initial hours after a disaster to approximate losses and damages and judge emergency responses needed. Detailed assessment can be conducted within 3 weeks using a further simple form. The fund also should use clear, simple language in its proposal request. Technical language can be a barrier. What exactly is required to demonstrate the paradigm shift potential of a GCF project? For example, even members of GCF boards admit that they do not really understand what does paradigm shift means. In a lot of board deliberations, quite a few developed country board members mentioned that they don't even understand what paradigm shift means and what exactly it means for the project as well. And similar concerns were raised for innovation and transformation. What does it exactly mean? Because innovation can mean different things for different people. Additionally, processes will need to be developed for the fund to be able to respond to different types of events. Finance for rapid onset events could be triggered by a disaster, whereas slow onset events such as sea level rise might be better addressed through long-term planning rather than project mechanism. Mechanism must also be designed for dealing with non-economic losses and damages, such as to people's health, mobility, local knowledge, and cultural heritage, as well as biodiversity. For example, this funding can support collecting stories to help save the local knowledge and heritages from different organizations, by different organizations. Yeah. Our next recommendation is give support according to the need, not bankability. Principle of climate justice rather than of banking should guide decisions. Funding should be distributed on the basis of need, vulnerability, and human rights, and not the efficiency of spending or the ability of a project to attract finance or returns, which loss and damage is likely to generate. Yet bankability permits the discourse on climate finance. For example, the GCF board deliberations, more than half of concerns are raised by members of high-income countries were about the optimal use of funds and the economic efficiencies of projects. Financial mechanisms do not cause harm should be a top priority for this loss and damage fund. It should refrain from offering loans or other instruments that could increase the debt or exposure to financial volatility of countries that are already highly in debt. Yet between 2016 and 2020, 72% of all climate finance was in the form of loans. Similarly, insurance-based mechanism also for loss and damage should be framed around the principles of mutuality, solidarity, and accountability. People who are vulnerable often cannot afford to pay for insurance. At the same time, insurance might set a really high triggering for a payment, leaving people unable to claim in the aftermath of a disaster. If you look at the graph, it shows the total amount of GCF financing paid by GCF and then the amount of co-financing from the different organizations. So even though GCF doesn't have a minimum requirement for projects to have co-finance to be approved, the graph shows the positive biasness of having higher co-financing from different organizations. So we recommend that loss and damage fund should not focus on co-financing because it limits the ability of different organizations and different countries to access the fund. A lot of respondents from the survey mentioned that it limits their ability to submit a proposal and access the fund. Yeah. Define eligibility broadly to claim support. The fund will not be able to cover all the losses and damages which might amount to more than 435 billion by 2030 and 1 trillion by 2050 for low and middle income countries. Therefore, guidance on what and who can be funded needs to be set up to ensure that expectations are set appropriately, the process is transparent, and applicants do not waste time, energy, and capital making requests that cannot be financed. However, the fund must not restrict eligibility too tightly. Defining vulnerability in practice is not straightforward. The GCF, for example, has designated that half of adaptation funding should go to small island developing countries, least developed countries, and African countries. The Loss and Damage Fund could have similar priorities, but it also needs to ensure that the funding is available for other least low and middle income countries. For example, Pakistan's 2020 floods would not have qualified for funding if only countries that were designated as particularly vulnerable by the Green Climate Fund. So we have to widen or broaden the priorities for least developed countries and middle income countries. The Loss and Damage Fund should also avoid another issue that basically plagued adaptation projects in the GCF, the need to demonstrate additionality, that is separating climate change and development. One of our respondents from small island state countries mentioned that for a small island developing state, development and climate change has become a consolidated and integrated approach by the necessity of its small population and dispersed isolated geography. So we also recommend that Loss and Damage Fund should not include additionality as one of the requirements to get funded. We also recommend that the fund embrace the principle of locally led action and enable recipients to articulate their needs on their own term. This is a new idea. We do not really have any evidence to support this, but Loss and Damage Fund should try and kind of get the experience how it can work. The last slide, we argue that the low and middle income countries should be at the center, because even though the GCF has equal representation at the board, it doesn't necessarily mean or ensures that the participation of board members are also equal. We looked at 181 proposals, and we found that the number of concerns raised by developed countries and developing countries varies a lot. If you look at the graph, developed country board members raised 409 concerns to different proposals, whereas the developing country board members raised only for 147. So we kind of recommend to have a separate setup for the board, whereas looking at the GCF board and assuming this paper was published a little while ago, so we had an idea if the Loss and Damage Fund also have a board of 24 members, we would recommend having 12 members from developing countries, 8 members from developed countries, and 4 members from civil society. And the reason we argue that civil society members should have more authority at the board is if you look at the graph, even though there were like only 2 representatives from civil society, they raised even more concerns than developed countries. However, it did not go through the board a lot. That's why when watching all the videos, it felt like they are shouting towards the ocean. No one is responding from the other side. Even though they raised a lot of concerns, so out of that 181 projects, 49 projects received conditions by the board, and out of those 49 projects, only 14 projects received 1 or 2 conditions by the civil society, whereas all 49 projects received conditions from developed countries. So even though they raised more concerns, a lot less conditions got attached to the proposals. And why the numbers matters, mostly we have seen a kind of difference in the type of concerns developed country, developing country, and so civil society raises, where developed country raised a lot more concerns related to bankability, optimal use of fund, how they can manage the fund, all related to financial concerns, whereas civil society and developing countries raised concerns related to human rights, if the project will create more harm for the environment, or if it was gender inclusive or not, community people who are consulted or not. So you can see the differences between the concerns from different groups. So this is why we need more participation and kind of representation from each group so that they have more authority. So this is why we kind of recommend have more participation, because loss and damage is an issue for low and middle income countries, so they should have more representation in the board so that they have more participation at the same time have civil society organizations more authority at the board. So this is from my side. I would like to thank for your patience, even though I had a blunder in between, but you had your patience, and this is our paper. You can scan the QR code to access. This is open access paper, and I would be happy if you kind of share and read. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Istiakh, for this very detailed presentation on how the fund should look like in the near future, and it would be extremely interesting to hear and to know which, at the same time, will be the spaces left open at the moment still for this kind of changes that you advocate for with your paper and with your research. As you all know, there have been extensive negotiations on the Loss and Damage Fund over the year in 2023 under the Transitional Committee. And before getting to the final civil society part, perhaps, and the views of civil society in this panel, I would like to give the floor to the person who first told me about loss and damage in general in my life some years ago in Venice, which is Dr. Elisa Cagliari from Viracao and Jangada and CMCC. So the floor is yours. Tell us something more on this strange year.
So are you saying I've changed your life? Somehow. Yes. No, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Yes, it was a long time ago when I first told you about loss and damage, and I've been working on this issue for quite some time now, since 2014. And as a researcher, I come from research, also together with Lisa at UCL. But I've also had the opportunity to approach it from other perspective, including as a delegate, because I joined the Italian delegation last year, and the EU delegation too, explicitly focusing on loss and damage. So I had the opportunity to follow the whole process of the establishment of the fund, the work of the Transitional Committee, and now the decision here in Dubai very closely. But also from the perspective of the civil society, I started going to COPs with the Jangada Association, and there are many members of the association here in the room. This is a fantastic project of youth involvement in negotiations, so it also gave me the opportunity to think about loss and damage from a climate justice perspective. But I guess other people, including Harjeet, who just joined us, and Sam, we'll talk more about what loss and damage means for climate justice. So I thought that maybe my contribution to this panel was to share with you some reflections that I had as a researcher during the negotiations about some key aspects of how the Loss and Damage Fund was set up. And in particular, I would like to focus on the role that science had in the process, the way it was evoked most of the time, but also opportunities for science to contribute even more now that we move towards really make the fund up and running, and also when we think about the implementation phase. So when, loss and damage projects and responses will need to materialize. And I thought about focusing on two key issues: the issue of vulnerability and how it was dealt in the TC process, and the issue of quantification of loss and damage. And starting from the issue of vulnerability, maybe you've seen the decision, or you heard about, all the negotiations process, and the fund was made for assisting developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. What does particularly vulnerable mean? So this is not a new language. You can find reference to this kind of language in the same convention, the UNFCCC. It is used, I think, 3 times. And it has also been used in many decisions after that, including the loss and damage related decisions. But still, there's no official definition of what particularly vulnerable means. So you don't have a list of countries that are particularly vulnerable. It has been used and interpreted in a pretty fluid way, sometimes referring to seeds and LDCs, sometimes also to African countries, but again, at the end of the day, no final list. So when the Transitional Committee was asked to talk about the issue and to see, to discuss issues around, for example, eligibility and access to the fund, this was one of the key issues to be discussed. And not just within the Transitional Committee, but also within the research communities, but also civil societies communities. There were a lot of discussions on how we can actually operationalize this concept. And something that kind of I found interesting as a researcher was this kind of reliance on, first of all, on the IPCC, which is of course important, but if we really want to rely to the IPCC, we also need to recognize that there's no univoque or written in stone definition of vulnerability in the IPCC. In this sense, it's very clear that there are different definitions according to different disciplines. There are a lot of concepts that can be relevant. So there's no easy way to operationalize it. But still, the conversation started to revolve around vulnerability indexes, which is something, of course, very important that we use in the research communities, but they're not made for allocation purposes or to talk about eligibility. These are analytical tools, so we use them to better understand or to better describe, for example, the situation or circumstances within a country, but you can't really use them for disburse money. At least this is not what they were made for. And so, and just to give you an idea why this is the case and why there's no true or false vulnerability index, I looked up at how my country features in these different rankings. And I come from Italy, if it was not clear from my accent. And for example, if you take the environmental vulnerability index, we perform pretty badly. We are in the top 20 of most vulnerable countries. But then if you take, for example, the Notre Dame gain index, we're actually doing a better job because it considers more dimensions, not just the environmental component. And in that case, we rank 162. So of course, the fund was talking about developing countries. I'm not saying that this applies anyway to that discussion, but it's just to give you an idea of how sometimes within this process, we ask science in a way to answer very difficult questions, but these are political questions, and science basically cannot take the role of negotiators. And so this was, I think, an important experience also for me wearing this double hat. And it was not just like something interesting for me personally, but I think it would also play an important role now that we move towards the full operationalization of the fund, because of course we have a decision now which was adopted on the first days, but many details are still to be decided. And it will be the board to decide, for example, around allocation. And the Transitional Committee forwarded some recommendations on things that the board will need to take into account. And this includes, for example, the priority and needs of developing countries, but also the best available data and info, and information that could be used, but still, there's no easy way out, and this is going to be, again, a political question, but a question where, of course, science will be asked to play a role. And the second reflection that I wanted to share with you was around the issue of quantification. And by following the TC process, but also by reading newspapers now around the establishment of the fund, I heard talking about many numbers. For example, there are some estimates talking about $400 billion needed for loss and damage each year. There was a proposal during the Transitional Committee to have like a certain scale for the fund. I think it was around $100 billion per year. There are some other estimates coming from research saying that we need between 290 and 580 billions per year, by, no, not per year, by 2030. Anyways, I'm getting lost in all these numbers, but the point I wanted to make is that I was wondering, okay, fine, but where are these numbers coming from? And and I was asking this question because I had the pleasure, in a way, to work a lot with economists. And I know that quantification is not an easy task, and especially when talking about loss and damage. And for example, I'm writing a paper now with some colleagues who are economists. We also collaborated in the context of a report by FAO, which was launched here at COP, thinking about loss and damage in agriculture sector, in agri-food systems. And so we were thinking about, okay, what are the methodologies out there to assess loss and damage? And we realized that there are two big problems to start with. And the first one is about the definition of loss and damage. You know that we don't have in this space an official definition. And in research, this makes things very difficult because you need to assess something, but you don't have clarity around what you need to assess. So this is a big challenge to start with. The second, again, from a very scientific point of view, is the issue of attribution. So here we are talking about negative impacts from climate change, but attributing how climate change is contributing to enhance the probability of these negative impacts materializing. It's not easy. There's science being developed, like the probabilistic event attribution studies, but this is still in the making, and you can't really attribute every single event, also because it's an issue of data, but also of capacity to do so. You would need, I don't know how many people to do that every single time you have a negative impact. So these are the big problems, and then there are other problems in the sense that, for example, many existing methodologies focus on extreme events, but we've heard, for example, from Lisa that slow onset events are a big part of the loss and damage picture, but we are ill-equipped to assess impacts from those kind of events. We also heard that non-economic losses play a big part in the debate. Here also, again, we are still developing the right methodologies also to assess them, and then there's also an issue of how you combine economic, non-economic losses to get to a unique number in a way. And then, but there's also hope, because of course there are methodologies out there, but they have been developed at different scales, like at the very community level. There are some important contributions, for example, from the United Nations University. But if we try to go to a more aggregate level, things become a bit more complicated. And especially when we try to project stuff into the future, it's even more complicated because we need to use models. And integrated assessment models are usually employed to kind of come up with some estimates. But there, okay, I don't want to go to technicals also because I'm not sure I fully understand all the technicalities. But according to my colleagues, my economist colleagues, that there are still opportunities, let's say, to improve the way adaptation is modeled, so the way you end up assessing the residual impacts, which is what is accounted for as loss and damage in this kind of models. And then there are, for example, the results are very dependent on also the choices that the modelers make, so you can get different numbers according to the way, for example, to the discount rate that you decide to use. So there are some technicalities which are not, that can give different results. And yeah, I would say that in short, you have many uncertainties to deal with when you try to project these estimates into the future. But again, we're hopeful that also the decision that was taken here in Dubai will kind of encourage more research in this domain. And I don't think that this discussion around numbers was interesting only when setting up the fund, but it will even more be now that we have a fund and now that pledges have been made. So you mentioned the UAE, but for example, my country, Italy, is the biggest donor so far. We have 1 million euros pledged. But still, we will need to, first of all, to understand if these pledges not only will materialize, but whether this will be enough. And so the issue of quantification will come back, I'm sure. So these were my two key reflections as a researcher navigating also negotiations, and I'm happy also to hear your thoughts and maybe to come back to some more technical issues in the Q&A session, also to reply to some of the questions that you, Lisa, posed during your presentation. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for the insights, and for the audience. Keep your questions. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the panel. We have 3 scientists working, studying, researching on loss and damage, so I think it's a great opportunity to know more also on the future of the fund. The Italian Climate Network, of which I'm a proud member of, is also a proud member of Climate Action Network International. And as you have seen, we have been joined by Harjeet Singh, who is the head of global political strategy at CAN International. And I would like to give him the floor for a quick contribution on how the negotiations are going according to CAN, as I know that you have 10 to 15 minutes with us, so we would really like to hear your voice and your sight on this COP28. Harjeet, please.
Jacopo, it won't be fair if I do that. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Adao, who has been leading the group of LDCs, and we are very honored to have him in the room. If you allow me, I would like to invite him to the dais here and actually speak about, and I'm happy to add anything from civil society perspective. Ambassador Adao, if you can please come and share your reflections. Who would be the better person than you to do that, please? Sorry, I'm taking over your role, which was not my original intention.
No problem at all.
But when I saw Ambassador Adao, I was like, I should not be doing that intervention. I can add if required. Please.
It is a great pleasure to have with us Ambassador Adao Soares Barbosa, Special Envoy and Ambassador at Large for Climate Affairs of Timor-Leste. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
And before he speaks, because he's not going to talk about it, I need to talk about it. You know, we don't get to see things from the outside. But he is one of those very few people who have fought so hard to get this fund where it is right now. This year has been excruciating for him and many of his colleagues and members of the Transitional Committee who were so committed, and they made sure that we get over the line, and it wasn't easy. You know, the negotiations were running into nights. You know, we had time where I'm sure we didn't have even a chance to eat, and the way he kept going and talking about how we need to have those crucial elements in the text and making sure that it's meaningful, and a lot of credit goes to him to make that happen. And I think we should absolutely acknowledge the hard work that has gone into it and the commitment that made it happen. You know, sometimes we only look at actions on the outside and the noise we created, but this is a quiet work, and which required a lot of commitment and passion and perseverance to make it happen. And I have a lot of respect for him, the way he represented least developed countries, but also continued talking with us and other groups to make it happen. So it was, you know, it was a true leadership that I saw. So thank you very much. So sorry, I took a lot of time, but I had to say that.
Harjeet, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the floor. I am late because I was invited to speak another side event, so I'm late. Even my time for here is crashing with negotiating time, but anyway. Once again, thank you very much. I think we were very strong because of civil society support. And Harjeet and the team, I think they always support us. So we were feeling that, especially I was feeling that I'm not alone. So that's why we established the Loss and Damage Fund, Baby has no name, but loss and damage fund is there. So in terms of my experience with regard to loss and damage issues, it was in 2009. I've been negotiating these loss and damage issues on behalf of the LDCs since 2009, when we separated loss and damage from adaptation issues. So I've been coordinating loss and damage issues on behalf of the group since 2009 and up to date. So in fact, we established the WIM-XCOM, and it was in 2013, and we were hoping to have 2 more layers for addressing loss and damage. One was about financial facility, we call it financial arm. Another one was about technical arm. So then by Madrid, we established Santiago Network for catalyzing technical assistance, and by COP27 last year, we established a loss and damage fund and funding arrangement. So 3 layers are there. So for WIM, we have XCOM, it's a policy arm, and then we have a technical arm, it's a Santiago Network, and also we have a financial arm, is a funding and fund arrangement for loss and damage. So in terms of the negotiation process that we had in the past, it was very difficult. And even Article 8 was also very difficult by Paris. But in fact, when we established loss and damage fund in COP27, it was also not easy. But then we established, and then we have operationalized this. But for operationalization of this fund, we, as one of the TC members, it was very hard to get the fund to be operationalized. But then, like the previous speaker said, that it was very difficult to decide the issue of vulnerabilities. But if you look through para 60 of the governing instrument, 60F, there is a minimum percentage allocation to the LDCs and SIDs. So I just want to react to that. But it was also issue of developing countries. We really negotiated within G77 and China, and then we came up with 60A and 60F. So 60A is about all developing countries are vulnerable, but 60F is some special circumstances given to LDCs and SIDs. But in fact, when money comes, I think we still need some time to discuss at board level, and then board will decide how could disperse money to the most vulnerable one, especially for LDCs and small island developing states. But we are still hoping that the board will decide some guidance with regard to the disbursement issues. But for LDCs, we need to have a quick, rapid disbursement issues once we are affected by the impact of climate change, especially extreme weather events. And in terms of slow onset event, we may have a programmatic approach, but it will be also not going to very bureaucratic procedural issues like that one that we are having for DCF and also adaptation fund. So we need to make difference on that issue. But for rapid extreme event, we need to receive money quickly to address the early recovery issues, rehabilitation issues, reconstruction issues that we need to be taken. I think that's critically important. So this is from my side, but in terms of the pledges, I think it's more than 700 millions. It's almost 1 billion, but we are hoping that more contributions will be taking place, and then I think at least 100 billion per year is required to fulfill all the needs of developing countries, but especially LDCs and small island developing states. Thank you very much.
Please, Harjeet.
I don't think I have to add a lot. The only thing I would like to say that something which is not getting a lot of visibility is another victory that we have, again, thanks to the leadership of Ambassador Adao and others who are working on Santiago Network. And that is an extremely important aspect, because if we really want countries to get started now on the impact assessment and what is needed, that technical capacity, and we have researchers here, is the essential first step to first recognize what is needed. How are we looking at a 1.2 degree warmer world and 1.3 degree warmer world and beyond, unfortunately? And that Santiago network is going to help us develop those plans, which then need to be funded. So as he said, this architecture was in mind several years ago, and we have been fighting and negotiating for it. Eventually, at this COP, we are going to have both these arms operationalized, which means that we have a new journey starting from this COP. And engagement exactly of the research community and everybody. We want all hands on deck approach so that we make sure now to use Santiago network. Coming from India, I tell my government absolutely clearly that you need to engage with the loss and damage discussions not from a money perspective. You are a large country. Yes, it is highly vulnerable, but there are many more countries ahead of you. Santiago network is one point of engagement which is extremely crucial. For a country like India, which is sending satellite to the moon, we have that satellite technology. We are studying oceans. We have capacity to do other habitat studies. Let's share that expertise. You can learn a lot from Timor-Leste. You can learn from Bangladesh. They are doing some huge innovations for resilience and for recovery from disasters. So it has to be that exchange. And Santiago network has to be implemented and in a true spirit of a network. So where, of course, we need resources from the global north, but there's a lot where South-South cooperation can also happen. So that's one. On loss and damage fund, we need to really figure out, Ambassador, we did not talk about it, $700 million. World Bank is saying it's going to take 6 months to come back on how it's going to include those policies, then 1 year to put policies in place. How do we get that 7 million to countries like Timor-Leste and Nepal's and Malawi's of the world? That process has to begin now. So we need to really start now talking about money going, because that was the argument of getting the World Bank, that money has to reach people. That's the next step. Yes, we can work on the allocation framework, but needs are there. Countries need support right now. Let's start channeling that money. And we can, you need to decide and discuss within the group. If temporarily we can use some other channel, honestly, as civil society, we would say fine, because we are setting up the fund. Let that, the whole purpose is to get the money to communities and countries. So we need to discuss that. Of course, in this hullabaloo, we could not talk about all those details, but that to me is a very important step to start delivering on the money. And then, of course, as you said, we need hundreds of billions of dollars. So how do we get that? And that's why we are saying here, if we get a decision on fossil fuel phase out, we should also start talking about, I was just at the action on make polluters pay. And that's why I got late. So we need to make polluters pay. We need to make sure that we have more and more money coming now to this fund. We have created this fund. And that's why in the text it says all options are open. So rich countries and corporations and philanthropies, let's make sure that this fund is filled to a level which is commensurate to the need. And I would also say, let's also work on the accountability system so that money reaches people that it is intended for. And as civil society, we will be very happy to work with you at various levels, and we are committed to continue our engagement, because, as I said, this is a new journey, and we now need to make sure that money is delivered and polluters are held to account, and this fund reaches that level that, as per our expectations and as per our needs, because eventually we have to make sure that all needs are fulfilled and their rights are protected. Because people are already suffering. We can't wait any longer. We have to just get going and make sure it is now delivering justice on ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Soares Barbosa, and thank you very much also to Harjeet Singh from Cannes International. And as we switched to civil society voices, I would like to hear our last speaker of today, Saleemul from the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, a group that has been active for years in negotiations and now has set up also a research group among the many working groups. And I'm happy to give the floor to Saleemul, who is one of the young researchers on loss and damage in this great organization. So Saleemul, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure being here. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who has spoken before me, and also thank you to the recent speakers. I know we have like a lot of things with can in the areas of loss and damage. And I would just like to echo that we, the youth, especially in the LDYC, that is Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, we are strongly behind the civil society in the areas of addressing these planetary issues when it comes to loss and damage. And even though we know that a lot of things has come up recently, first with the test, which we actually saw that, okay, yeah, this is a test that has come up, but even though this test has already existed and opening it will cause a lot of harm, we also hope that that test could be revisited if possible. But beyond just looking at the test, we are really glad that the Loss and Damage Fund has been established, because part of what we don't really want is making countries impoverished by loans. This is something that we are really, really scared of. And in that test is contained here that all options of funding can be explored, including loans. And, bringing the World Bank into the picture, we already know what the World Bank, what they like doing, which is the loan aspect. And then we know that the governing board for the Loss and Damage Council being established, we know that test could be revisited and things could progress. And then for the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, part of what we are looking at is, the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, which has been done, and we have ticked that for us, which is a yes. And then we are also looking at, empowering the Santiago network on loss and damage to, start functioning. The Santiago network, like rightly mentioned, is very, very important because it's going to provide not just technical but institutional, body in addressing loss and damage. Now, institutional body means, bringing out more research, looking at solutions, looking at programs, that could be taken into place to, reduce the impact of climate change-induced disasters in climate-vulnerable communities. Climate change is real, but I believe a step taken to, address these issues can be a step in the right direction in reducing the degree of these issues occurring in communities. In the Loss and Damage Coalition, we have carried out some research on the exacerbated effect of climate change-induced disasters in climate-vulnerable communities and the adaptation capacities, particularly in sub-Saharan African countries. And we carried out case studies in 5 sub-Saharan African countries, which includes Nigeria, Mozambique, Liberia, Sudan, and Uganda. And in these 5 sub-Saharan Africas, we took this under study. We found out that these countries, even though they are highly vulnerable, they also, lack comprehensive data to, be able to make some comparative analytic studies to see if, these countries, the degree of the induced impact they are actually facing. And beyond just, this data disparity, we also found out that these countries, they are more stressed compared to any other country, when it comes to climate-induced disaster. Like, for instance, in Mozambique, they do more with the cyclones, that happens often in that area. And you also look at the amount of lives being, displaced, apart from being displaced, but even being lost in that process. And while we also look at dissect these factors, we also, think about what loss is and what damage is. Because when we talk about economic and non-economic, you can quantify it as one being damaged and as one being lost. Because, for instance, when you talk about damage, when this is damaged, you can repair it, you can fix it. If this mic I'm using to talk right now is damaged, it's something you can take to someone to, to fix. But if this mic is beyond damage, it's lost actually. You can't even fix it, and that is our major concern. The non-economic loss and damage is a major concern, and the Loss and Damage Coalition, we've also published a policy brief on non-economic loss and damage, which we believe will help not just youth, but even the global society in addressing climate change issues when it comes to providing a policy framework. I'm glad when he mentioned about the WASO ESCOM on loss and damage, which is very, very, very good. But I'm still hoping to see a policy framework, that intentionally talks about loss and damage and how it needs to be operated and how the operationalization will follow suit. Because when we are talking about countries giving fund, I believe that fund has been a major thing that countries are committed to do when it comes to giving that numbers. Countries give that number. We saw the $100 billion, the adaptation fund, and even till date, we can't really account for that fund. Like, we can't give an accurate account that this was what was made with that fund, but until earlier this year, I think, during SB 58, that was when we started hearing figures that this amount was released this year, this amount was released this year. Before now, we couldn't give account for that. And we don't want that to happen for the loss and damage fund. We want a policy framework to come out. We are people that, beyond just giving that fund, but people that are making that commitment are held accountable in one way or the other. We believe that once this policy is made available by WASO ESCOM, which we believe is a body that has the ability to make that framework into existence, because I believe I see the WASO ESCOM divided into about 5 task force units that regulate its activity. I believe they can be able to come up with something, and once that is done, Santiago Network will move further in providing an institutional idea or knowledge on how this fund can be programmed into a lot of initiatives, and also how this fund can be run. And then that is what I feel for the Loss and Damage Coalition is important. But most importantly, I'll round up with this, that the Loss and Damage Fund, is being established without considering youth. I'll have to say that. Because when you consider youth, I don't think you would actually, push it so hard in a way with those texts being contained in the loss and damage, in the funding, in the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. For instance, the governing council did not even make any provision for how youth can be nominated. It talks about how parties can, bring in their nominees, but there was no provision for youth, and that is a major concern. The present and the future is youth. For any community to survive is youth. Youth makes up over 50% of the global population. And when you are looking at that figure, it means that even the initiatives and the implementation process of the operation of the loss and damage, when it comes to the down line of carrying out the implementation process, you're going to need definitely you to be the manpower and the powerhouse. And this is actually missing, and it's really painful that we came this far and we are being excluded from the whole thing. And I feel this is also me going back to the council, the governing council of the board for loss and damage. I feel once it's been established, once that board is being formed, I feel they can review where youths can have a table, can have a role to play in the loss and damage fund itself. Because part of what youth is facing is assessing fund, The GCF, which is the Green Climate Fund, you can't access that fund due to the complexity of it, where you have to get government approvals and all. And we don't really want that, even though the test in the loss and the operationalization test for the TC says, the fund should be easy to access, but we know what happens when it's being governed by parties, the complexity becomes even obvious, and that is not what we actually want. And we are also standing by this to say that in all the youth globally, we want their voice to be heard, and beyond just being heard, we want them to start taking actions for themselves. And that can only be possible when youth is given the ability to partake directly, not indirectly, directly in the decision-making process and in the governing process of the Loss and Damage Fund. Thank you.
Another comment by Harjeet, maybe.
Sorry, I have to leave, so I thought I'll just make a comment before I go. And I also want to...
It's working?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Also want to use the presence of Mr. Adam. No, it's not working. Anyway.
Sabotage.
So the current discussions that are happening on GST and NCQG, New Collective Quantified Goal, we are hearing certain parties such as European Commission saying European Union saying that it is not linked to NCQG conversation. And when we say the scale is not mentioned, that is your hook. So it is mentioned in GST, but not in the NCQG conversation. I just wanted to highlight that. So we need to make sure that new collective quantified goal does have a section on loss and damage. Replenishment cycle, we got it only for 4-year cycle. I think we need a much more frequent cycle, the way disasters are increasing, because the 4 years, which means we will not have more attention on the issue if we keep it every 4 years. Disasters are increasing and needs are scaling up. And I would like to turn the table on young people and throw a challenge. So you say you need participation at the global level. I would say a lot more work is also needed at the national level. We all have to go back and make sure that we fix the system at the national level. If you remember our dear Saleemul, he was working so hard to create a national mechanism on loss and damage, a replica of Warsaw International Mechanism at the national level. And it's not easy because you have to bring various departments together. So a lot of policy alignment work needs to happen at the national level. So I would encourage youth and research community and civil society to go back and also fix the system, because we now have this fund, money will start flowing, and imagine if we don't have a system which is fixed, which can receive the money properly and make sure it is spent well, it involves civil society, that also needs to happen simultaneously. So we need to make sure that flow is there a lot, and that requires a lot of work. Saleem spent years on it, and imagine a country like Bangladesh, which is so aware and a leader, there are challenges. So I think we need to definitely do that, and without that policy alignment and without the role of civil society, we will not be able to use those resources properly. So I would say we have a work to do not only at the global levels, but also at the national and regional levels, and that's where youth can play a very important role to make sure that the system is accountable, as we say, from local to global levels. Thank you.
Again, thank you. Again, thank you very much to Harjeet Singh from Khan International. I would like to devote the last 9 minutes of this panel to the Q&A, but you gave me the opportunity by talking about the national level to mention, as the Italian Climate Network, what we did this year. We launched a campaign in Italy on loss and damage finance, because we had the feeling that nobody was talking about the topic at the national level, indeed. And we decided, together with other organizations in the European Union as part of the Spark consortium, to launch this campaign before our eyes, sotto i nostri occhi, before our eyes, as communities being displaced, as disasters already happening in the world. And this campaign was targeting influencers on social media and the government, and people in Rome, people in the parliament. And we were asking to talk about the Loss and Damage Fund and to talk about financing the Loss and Damage Fund, because nobody did ever launch a similar campaign in my country, at least, in Italy. Together with some other organizations and scientists, we decided to work as well on a resolution which was presented in the parliament in Italy last month by an opposition party. And we decided together to try to write down a figure for the first time, a number. And we decided that 100 million euros would have been an okay number for a topic that has never been tackled in the country at all, and that we already knew was not in the budget for next year, in the state budget for next year. Quite incredibly, the majority in the parliament rejected that text and approved another one without any figure. But when we arrived here at COP, President Meloni announced 100 million euros for the Loss and Damage Fund, as well as Germany, as well as France, and after the United Arab Emirates. And we were extremely surprised because there was really a no topic until a month and a half ago. And then it became the way my government, our government, arrived here at COP. At the same time, we discovered that less than 2 months before landing at COP, our government facilitated somehow, or had a role in a new agreement between the government-owned Saipem, which is a gas company in Italy, and ADNOC, worth $13 billion. And some 5-6 weeks after that, 100 million arrives for loss and damage. I'm not saying that there is a direct correlation between the two and that there have been dialogues in this sense, but just to give you the dimension and the scale of the difference of what governments are still doing in that stage, investing in oil and gas while pledging for the loss and damage fund, which is a good thing. But yeah, let's keep eyes open on the wider picture all the time. I took 2 minutes more than I wanted for myself, so now the floor is open for questions, and please be brief. Please, first row. Is there a mic there? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Awais Khalid. I'm from Pakistan. I'm currently a graduate student at Indiana University. Pakistan experienced the 2022 floods. $9 billion was pledged to the country from multilateral development banks and from countries, out of which less than $1 billion has actually been disbursed to the country 1 year after the events. And most of it has been because multilateral development banks have been relying on projects that are bankable and not on based on what people's needs are. And mainly the problem there is that to build projects that are bankable, you need capacity, local capacity, you need data to be able to back that up, be able to convert that and translate that into the language of those multilateral development banks. And that's something that you, Istiakh, also spoke about during your talk. My question specifically is that the Santiago network has been operationalized, and it will take a little time for that technical capacity to become available and to go to countries. In the short term, before that happens, how can we try to increase indigenous capacities to try to get that money that has been pledged, specifically in, for example, the case of Pakistan as well, the $9 billion that have been pledged, how can we work around that to try to get that money to the communities that are vulnerable and that need it the most? Thank you.
Yes, maybe we can collect some 3 questions before. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for this panel. I wanted to ask about how you got to that number of the 100 million. We know that I know it has been challenged, the 400 hundreds of billions that we need, but I like to share that in Puerto Rico, one event was 100 billion. This is one island, one event. So like we're very far off of the scale that we're needing. And also to share, you know, like there has been like several pledges, and there are also the 100 billion of France is actually at the national level, not to the fund. And see how can we come with better metrics, because the vulnerability index and the data that it's out there is very reductionist, and we need to think about, like for example, Pakistan experienced the floods, and also middle-income countries are also very vulnerable to these, and that's why there was that challenge between the eligibility and the allocation at the TC meetings where we were there in person. So I would like to hear more about some of the thoughts and also about the methodology about the 100 million.
Thank you. Maybe one more if someone wants to ask. Okay, we have 4 minutes in total then. I would start from Istiakh, as the first question was directed to you, if I understood correctly also. Yes. Maybe in 1 minute, and then we go with a final round of table for those who want to answer.
Thank you. So in our research, we also kind of got that essence that you already have mentioned, that a lot of the time, institute like GCF that has a lot of requirements and a lot of indicators that have to be matched, and countries countries that are not kind of that much has resources, organizations, community organizations, and local organizations that doesn't have that much resource, it becomes a barrier for them. That type of data and that type of the type of data and that type of proposals that need to access those funds. It's unfortunately we haven't been able to kind of look at how we can enhance capacity of those organizations or communities. But one thing that can be done, at least from my side, I think, is to have collaborations. And nowadays we always use locally led organization, locally led action, but at the same time I feel it kind of has become a buzzword where we see the format is the same. The top like organizations, international organizations, they go to the community and with the setup, kind of fixed setup that they already had, and collect data from the community. Often we have seen the community doesn't have that much access towards that international organization, it's not depending on the community who when they want, they can go to the international organization, but rather it depends on the international organization when they go to the community. I think having a kind of balanced access will help in enhancing their capacity as well, where they can decide when they want to go towards that, and they also can decide what's the format it would be. So it's just a thought, yeah.
I'll be very brief. I think
In a tweet.
Yeah, maybe answering both questions at once is that when thinking about how we think about methodologies or quantification or metrics with loss and damage, there's a real risk in taking a top-down approach that's really about trying to identify a number or think about a kind of broad set of metrics, whereas what we know works best is thinking about how do communities themselves understand what loss is and what's a tolerable loss and what's an intolerable loss. And so there's this real tension in the research between these bottom-up and top-down approaches, and we want to avoid the perverse incentives of just paying attention to the global governance questions around this.
Super quickly on the issue of scale, maybe it's worth noting that, and we're right, we're putting a lot of attention to the fund, but the fund is not supposed to make it all. But the decision was also about the funding arrangements, meaning that there's also, I know that it was contentious, but from a research perspective, we also need to acknowledge that there's a lot of fragmentation out there. So we also need to work on that fragmented landscape and try to unlock resources that are, and because we need as much as we can, and so we can also try to be a bit pragmatic.
Samuel, you want to add something? We have 40 seconds before the end of the streaming, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Ambassador, please.
Quickly, with regard to financial inputs, I think the board will develop more technical guidance to provide, or at least to engage our partners to put money there. And after that, the board will also provide recommendation to the Conference of Parties to engage parties who are willing to put money in place that will be useful. And I believe that the board will be possibly having some sort of, let's say, side events or workshops or events that will be also considering as tools for engaging people to put money together. So I think that's for my side. But in terms of youth involvement, there will be also technical let's say, guidance provided by the board, how to include all, vulnerable people, youth, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency, for sharing your thoughts. We're running out of time. In terms of the 100 million we asked in Italy, we just compared them to the pledge made by Germany last year under the Global Shield, 170, and comparing the historical emissions, we decided that 100 million could be a figure that could have been politically doable for a government which has never talked about loss and damage before. That's why we decided to work that way. I would like to thank and to give a round of applause to our fellow panelists for today. Istiakh Ahmed, our partners from Northeastern University, Professor Lisa Van Hala from University College of London, Dr. Elisa Cagliari from the CMCC and Viracao and Jangada, Harjeet Singh from Climate Action Network International, and Samuel O'Corrier from the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. I would also like to thank Saleemul, who unfortunately is not with us today as planned, and to thank our guest speaker of today, Ambassador Adao Soares Barbosa from Timor-Leste. Thank you very much, and I wish you a wonderful last 2 days of COP28.